There are game studios we thought would never go away no matter what the circumstances are, and with some of them we were wrong.
You lose! Good day, sir!
Some truly historically incredible studios are just dead, and I think we should pour one out for some of them right now. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanx, 10 legendary game studios that have vanished. Starting off with number 10, it's Monolith Productions. These were the guys that you'd think would have been around forever. All the guys making groundbreaking FPS games back in the 90s, mostly still alive. id Software, still making Doom games. Raven is doing good work, putting their stamp on the Call of Duty franchise. Even 3D Realms, the guys behind Duke Nukem 3D and, ultimately the causes of Duke Nukem Forever, if not directly behind it, they're still around in at least some form. I guess the guys who made Duke 3D are gone, but the name's still there. Monolith is one of those studios. They made Blood, a truly classic among shooters. What was so impressive about Monolith is just how versatile they could be. They never settled for just one franchise or just one type of game. They were always experimenting, making unique and interesting stuff. Their catalog of games, honestly, hit after hit. Blood in 97, Shogo in 98, Blood 2 in 98. And that one sucked, but it wasn't Monolith's fault there. It's a whole thing. 2000 had No One Lives Forever, which is an awesome spy-themed FPS that was just way ahead of its time. And in 2005, there was, of course, Fear, one of the all-time great shooters. The slowdown time, the destruction, the fantastic AI, the creepy atmosphere. This one, it had all of it in the same year. They also put out Condemned Criminal Origins, which was also a really good first-person horror game, more of a focus on melee combat and exploration, but not a lot of devs put out two very good games in 1 year, especially devs of this size. And then in 2014, we got the first Middle-earth game, Shadow of Mordor. In a lot of ways, it's kind of an Arkham City copycat, but the whole Nemesis system stuff was really groundbreaking, at least in concept, and it was pretty damn fun. They had a sequel, which expanded on it. It was also damn fun. I love the Nemesis system, actually. After that, though, they went to work on their next game, and it never came together. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes at Monolith or Warner Brothers, but something went seriously wrong. Up until 2014, the longest gap between game releases from this studio was just 3 years. After Shadow of Mordor, we got nothing for 8 years, and then Warner shuttered the studio entirely. Prior to the shutdown, reports were circulating that their next game would have been based on Wonder Woman. It already had $100 million dumped into it, and even at the start of 2025, the game was not in a releasable state. Going by that, not hard to understand why Warner closed the studio, but I've got to imagine the blame flows both ways here. Maybe Monolith just didn't have it anymore, or maybe Warner kept spinning them in circles trying to squeeze the live service game out of them. Lord knows that's happened. Everything I ever hear about them makes them sound clueless, but the common narrative that all game studios are closed because of greedy publishers, that's not always true. Maybe all the talent left, there's no enthusiasm for whatever the next project was, whether it was Wonder Woman or something else. Who really knows? But it does suck to see them go. Studios as long-running and legendary as this deserve to live on in some form, even if their best years are behind them. And number 9 is Arkane Austin, and it's a complicated one because Arkane, as a studio, is still around. Their main studio in Lyon, France, it's still there, but the Austin studio is no more. It was closed down by Microsoft in 2024, along with several other Bethesda studios. So while Arkane as an entity still exists and is apparently working on a game based on the Marvel character Blade, one of their key studios is no more. Founded in 2006, the Austin studio's actual contributions are a little nebulous for a lot of their games because at first, both the Lyon studio and the Austin studio worked together on projects. We know they're at least partially responsible for the first Dishonored, but their one true legendary accomplishment on their own was 2017's Prey, a game they worked on exclusively while the main office made Dishonored 2. And while that sequel is fantastic, Prey is probably Arkane's best game. It's the ultimate immersive sim. It's a highly systematic game with a huge interconnected space station and all these interlocking systems. It makes my head spin. And like most of Arkane's output, Prey wasn't a massive success, but it earned the studio a lot of respect and admiration. It was a true expression of what people expected from an Arkane game. First person, lots of player freedom, intricate level design, physics, interaction, lots of stuff. It's unfortunate the real history of Arkane is one of constantly scrapping to get by, working as a support studio on other games, making many failed prototypes, including at least one Half-Life 2 expansion pack and one game produced by Steven Spielberg, of all people, because at least for a little while, when they did get the chance, they made something magical. And then there's Redfall, the studio's follow-up to Prey, which was live service, always online, and nothing like what the studio was known for. Why even bother? From what I read, it sounds like Bethesda was looking to sell, so they decided to inflate their value by starting up development on a bunch of live service projects. Keep in mind, this was the late 2010s, and it seemed like live service equaled infinite money. The problem was that nobody in Arkane actually wanted to make Redfall. It was not the kind of game people who joined Arkane wanted to make. So apparently, and this is a crazy number, 70% of the studio who actually worked on Prey had left by the time Redfall actually came out. Also, it failed. For all intents and purposes, not a good game. So Microsoft shut down the studio. Their actual output wasn't always consistent, but sometimes all it takes is one or two truly great games to make a studio legendary, and their work on the Dishonored games, and Prey in particular, was next level. And number 8 is Ready at Dawn. Formed in 2003. This studio was mostly known for their surprisingly high-quality adaptations of PlayStation properties to handhelds. Their first game, Daxterm, which is based on Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter games, it was surprisingly good for a game not made by the main studio, as was their God of War games for the PSP, which are practically as good as the mainline games. The kind of graphics they were able to push on the PSP was also remarkable, especially in Ghost of Sparta, which might be their best game overall. It's not just good for a handheld God of War game, it's legitimately one of the best games in the franchise. After proving themselves on the PlayStation Portable, they took their technical expertise and made what is still one of the most graphically impressive games of all time with The Order 1886. More of a tech demo than a real game. Really cool concept, deserved to be fleshed out given the time it needed. But in terms of visual fidelity, you can't deny how good this game looks for a PS4 game in 2015. It's one of those games that needs a sequel to expand and improve on the ideas of the first, but it unfortunately never happened. After the failure of The Order 1886, Ready at Dawn moved on from their collaborations with Sony and took their technical know-how to the world of VR. They made an excellent game called Lone Echo. It was published by Oculus Studios, and sadly, Meta, also known as Facebook, bought them in 2020 and then closed them 4 years later. The recent history of Facebook, Meta, whatever, is just one boneheaded decision after another, so it wasn't really a surprise they'd do absolutely nothing with a talented developer like Ready at Dawn after acquiring them, but it sucks a lot. I wish something would happen like with the Savage Planet people, where they formed another company and kept making games. That'd be nice, but also it's not Ready at Dawn. And number 7 is Volition. God, this list just stings as we move along. You probably know these guys for their Saints Row games, but they actually got their start a lot earlier, way back in 1993, and it actually put them up there with gaming titans like id Software and fellow casualty Monolith. It's another studio with a hell of an eclectic catalog. They were guys who were always trying out new things, and to their credit, it mostly worked. If you want to be clear, Descent was a technical marvel at its time, and also something I wasted more time than you could possibly imagine playing. They wanted to do Descent 2 and Free Space, huge games in their own right, but one of their more overlooked titles were the Summoner games. They're fantasy RPGs for PS2. They're pretty underrated, and they're both completely different from one another, while still having that particular Volition quirkiness and humor. Their work on the Red Faction games is more well known. The first is noteworthy just for its destruction technology, but the best game in the series didn't come out until the Xbox 360 with Red Faction Guerrilla, which, by the way, even though it's a huge pain in the ass to get into the game using the Steam Deck, I grin and bear it. I play that game to this day. That's not just the best Red Faction game, it's probably the best modern Volition game, period. Their innovation in destruction technology was combined with a fast and fun open world game. It was incredible. No other game has been able to match this goddamn game. Not even its own sequel, Armageddon, which is a linear FPS against some bug monsters. It doesn't do anything for me. And then, of course, there is the Saints Row titles. For a little while, these games were the true successors, or the at least main competition of the GTA formula, where Rockstar took the series in a more dour, serious direction with GTA 4. Saints Row embraced the goofier parts of the Vice City and San Andreas thing, and it was a solid open-world shooter in its own right. The series got goofier and stranger until it went completely off the deep end with Saints Row 4, and the series, I mean, it wasn't bad. It was insane, but bad is not a word I would use until we got to the reboot. The reboot. To say it didn't capture the energy of the originals, it doesn't do the reboot and its shittiness justice. I mean, it's a shame the story of Volition ends with the 1-2 punch of that and the previous Agents of Mayhem, because both those games they sucked. Volition was capable of great things, but they were on the decline by the time they got embraced. If you remember the Embracer debacle, I hope you haven't forgotten. Hashtag never forget. And while it was disappointing they got shut down, it also wasn't a huge shock given the critical drumming Saints Row, the reboot of it got. Rightfully so. I don't feel good about them being closed, but I don't feel confused about it either. And number 6 is Visceral Games. Oh my god. The Dead Space guys. Their history actually goes back further, though. Originally, they were just an EA subsidiary known as EA Redwood Shores. They worked on a ton of stuff, like, before they became the Dead Space guys. They were prolific for most of their run as a studio, even, making all kinds of stuff like Tiger Woods golfing games, a few racing games, some James Bond games, including the all-timer James Bond 007 Everything or Nothing, which had a story that's so insane that it made Die Another Day seem stately and dignified. They did the great Lord of the Rings beat-em-up games. I don't know if you remember those or not. They did the Godfather games, the My Sims games. Honestly, if a good game came out of EA, it's probably from them. Dead Space was without a doubt their breakout hit, though. After they did that, they got rebranded as Visceral Games, and even though, they were still making My Sims games for the Wii, their work on Dead Space is still some of the all-time best, though. Dead Space 1 and 2, those games are some of the few horror games to stand side by side with Resident Evil 4 as some of the best action horror games ever made. While the Dead Space games did get a lot of critical praise, they didn't quite sell as well as EA wanted. In the Xbox 360 era, a lot of their games were getting canceled and they were stuck making forgettable sequels to other EA properties like Army of Two, The Devil's Cartel, and Battlefield Hardline. They ended up being the last game with the Visceral name on it. When given free reign to make the kind of game they wanted, the results just spoke for themselves. The Dead Space games still hold up, especially the second. So of course EA did what EA always does eventually and forced the studio to work outside their expertise and close them because the games didn't do well. And number 5 is Origin Systems. That's tough, friends. Origin Systems needs no introduction. They're, in many ways, the prototypical legendary game studio that no longer exists. Founded back in 1983, this studio is single-handedly responsible for many massive innovations in the games industry and fostered some of its greatest talents. These guys made the Ultima series, okay? If that was it, that's legendary. But no, they made Wing Commander. Wing Commander! 2 legendary series. And they made the first true MMO with Ultima Online, which you could count that towards the Ultima series, but I'm not because it's a different beast altogether. That's 3 landmark contributions to gaming. And oh, that's not where they stopped, because they also did the first System Shock. Origin Systems' contribution to gaming history that can't be ignored. Yes, Richard Garrett, aka Lord British, is an embarrassing huckster these days, and Chris Roberts went on to do the never-ending debacle that is Star Citizen, but back in the 80s and early 90s, the work these guys were doing was absolutely groundbreaking. Sadly, those two lived long enough to become the villain, but at one time, they were heroes. I mean, Origins is where Deus Ex creator Warren Spector got his start. He even appears as himself in at least one of their games, which is so surreal to look back on. Even though he's another guy where his best games appear to be behind him, the way that Origin Systems didn't just innovate but also foster talent is what makes it such an important studio. Even many of the people who went on to found Arkane, they have connections with Origins. Same with Irrational Games, honestly. In fact, you want to circle around the immersive sim genre for a while, you kind of have to go back to Origin Systems. It's not 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, it's 6 degrees of Richard Garriott. So what happened to them? Well, that's actually pretty simple. EA happened. Origin was acquired by EA in 1992, and for a while things were fine. Some of their best games actually came from the EA partnership, but in the end they were a victim of their own success after Ultima Online came out. EA decided they wanted them to be an online-only studio. While their online game was doing well, the mainline Ultima games were getting worse. 8 was bad, 9 was a broken mess, and that game's failure ultimately led to the closure of Origins. Ultima was a foundational series. It being gone for good is like there being no more Doom games or no more Mario games. It's such a travesty that EA couldn't make it work with Origin systems. In a just world, they'd still be chugging along, making at least somewhat interesting RPGs. And number 4 is Free Radical. Oh, be still, my heart. Oh, founded by former Rare staff. This is one of those studios that feels like they should have done so much more. They never got the chance to make a lot of stuff, but they had a unique vision all their own that made them stand up, even in the often derivative FPS games market. Their real claim to fame is, of course, the Time Splitter series, which is the true successor to the GoldenEye and Perfect Dark games. They had a goofy energy to them that made them feel very unique. They're not just copycats of the old Nintendo 64 shooters. They certainly were made by the same people that made them, but the amount of "it's Free Radicals" thing, it is of itself. It insists upon itself. It's there. The multiplayer in these games is just so much fun. There was a level editor. There's tons of ways you could modify the experience. It's a form of multiplayer you almost never see anymore, but as a party game, Time Splitters, all of them, every single one, they hold up. Their forays into non-Time Splitters games, kind of a mixed bag. 2004's Second Sight was a pretty fun Psychic Powers game. In 2008, their PS3 exclusive Haze did not have the juice. It was a dull Halo copycat and just didn't have any Time Splitters energy, and that's frankly what they did. That's what they did. When you don't do that, it doesn't work. The studio shut down in 2008, but it was miraculously saved by German developer Crytek, who bought them up at the last minute. Seemed like a second chance for Free Radical. This was also around the time they were working on Star Wars Battlefront 3, which if you've ever seen the prototype footage of, it's a crime that game wasn't released. In fact, Free Radical is kind of, from this point on, just a series of false starts masquerading as a studio. The studio closed again in 2014, but also again, not really, because the entire staff was actually transferred over to the newly formed Dam Buster Studios. In 2021, seemed like Free Radical was getting another shot, like with Tango Gameworks or Clover, because the original studio, Free Radical, was reformed specifically to bring Time Splitters back to life. Yeah, I mean, it was like the dream, but only took 2 years and they got closed, probably this time for good. Unfortunate, because I feel like Free Radical offered something different than you usually get with FPSs. It was a more fun and less serious game while still being like a big budget major studio game that felt undeniably AAA. This is one that I lament this one. And number 3 is Core Design, a victim of its own success, honestly. They struck gold with 1996's Tomb Raider, which ended up being a massive success and went on to spend the next 5 years making the franchise happen as much as it could, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, they really milked the franchise for all it's worth. Core, not entirely to blame here. Eidos, or Eidos, I don't remember how to say it. They were probably the more culpable entity in nearly killing the Golden Goose, but from everything I've read, a lot of the blame can be actually placed on Core for this one. They may have hit it big in 1996, but they were founded back in 1988. They were making games for the Amiga and Atari ST and ZX Spectrum. They made a wide variety of games in a lot of genres, but I mean, Tomb Raider is their big one. Even when it was successful, they were making games in other genres on top of their yearly Tomb Raider releases. It's pretty obvious that the team was not prepared for the yearly release schedule, though. The review scores kept getting worse and worse. The series really failed to innovate or expand on the formula. The games mostly just got more frustrating, and by the time Tomb Raider Chronicles came out, players were pretty sick of the same old thing with, a slightly new coat of paint. Angel of Darkness was going to be the game that brought Tomb Raider into the next generation, but poor planning and management led to the game being in shambles and then finally dropped in 2003. Reviews were bad, sales weren't great, so Eidos took Tomb Raider from Core and put it in Crystal Dynamics, and they've been in charge of the franchise ever since. I'd say, honestly, for the better. Without Tomb Raider, the studio, it didn't last long. Most of the core staff walked, no pun intended. And while the studio shambled along for a while, leaderless and directionless for a few years, it was eventually closed in 2010 after becoming a support studio for Rebellion, which is actually a lot longer than I thought, but they weren't really making any real games at that point. The last two games were completely anonymous PlayStation portable games, like literally might as well not have made games. It's crazy to imagine a studio handling their own IP so poorly it was literally just taken away from them. Like, imagine if Bungie got Halo taken away from them rather than they decided to leave Microsoft. It's crazy, but that's exactly what happened here. And number 2 is SIE Japan Studio. Maybe hard to go back to the many PlayStation 1 games because of how archaic most of them are from both a visual and game design perspective. But if you're looking at the history of video games, it was one of the most creative and ambitious times in game development. Sony was throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick, and it made for a hugely varied and deep catalog of games. A lot of the best projects came out in this era from Sony's internal Japanese studio, which was really more of a publishing arm than a dedicated studio on its own. Knowing who worked on what can be difficult to pin down, but we do know all the games published by Japan Studio, and it's a lot. There's the Ape Escape games, Legend of Dragoon, all the Team Ico games, including Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian. They made the Siren games, some of the best survival horror games of all time. They partnered with From Software to make the first Demon Souls, and while Sony thought that game was crap, it ended up being one of the most influential games of all time. It's just one great game after another. They did the Puppeteer and the Gravity Rush games. A lot of the Japan Studio games didn't sell all that well, but they were all highly rated. Well, they weren't all highly rated. The ones that were notable were highly rated and respected, and their connection to Sony's consoles gave the brand prestige. The dedication to their Japanese studios gave Sony cred with core gamers. Unfortunately, Sony did not respect what they had. Sure, Sony's Western developed games were well received and sold well, but Japan Studio provided variety. They offered an alternative to the big budget AAA Cryfest. So when Sony restructured in 2021, they effectively eliminated the Japanese game development teams. The old school Sony fans were understandably upset. The only remnant of Japan Studio still standing is Team Asobi, the guys responsible for one of the few bright spots in what was otherwise a pretty dismal 2024 for Sony Entertainment, with Astrobot maybe dumping all their tried and tested Japanese game developers to throw away hundreds of millions on multiple live service game debacles wasn't the brightest idea. And finally, at number 1, Silicon Knights. This one's maybe number 1 for being interesting. They're legendary, maybe not for the right reasons, though. To their credit, I mean, they did manage to make some good games. The original Blood Omen is a top-down action RPG classic. Eternal Darkness is horror game royalty, and one of their best games on the GameCube was their remake of Metal Gear Solid, which is praised by many as being superior to the original version. I mean, it also had its share of controversies and arguments regarding voice actors and some choices, but honestly, seriously, Twin Snakes is great. They made some truly great games, and they made some bad ones, like X-Men Destiny, but what makes Silicon Knights truly legendary was their seemingly endless feud with the rest of the game industry. These guys just could not help but burn every bridge possible, every bridge available, while shooting themselves in the foot. Reading their history, it's a comedy of errors. They could not stop self-sabotaging. It was like it was a pastime for them. Even as far back as Blood Omen, they got an illegal feud with Crystal Dynamics over the game's sequel. They cut ties with Nintendo after being unimpressed with the technical specs of the Wii, so they stepped away from Nintendo before the release of their most popular system to date up to that point. Also, they could make like a forgettable game on the Xbox 360 called Too Human. Some other games too that I literally just don't remember them. It all came crashing down in 2014 as the years of legal battles finally took their toll. For some completely unfathomable reason, they decided, let's sue Epic Games in 2007, claiming their version of the Unreal Engine, the one that Epic gave them, was somehow worse than the one Epic was using for its own games, which Epic decided to countersue because they said that Silicon Knights stole Unreal 3 engine code to make their own proprietary engine, which they provably did. The legal beatdown was so bad that Silicon Knights was ordered to recall and destroy unsold copies of Too Human and X-Men Destiny. I mean, to be fair, not the biggest loss of all time, but I mean, it was far from the only blunder made by this company, but it was easily the biggest, and it would eventually lead them to closing their doors permanently in 2014, but only after years of promising an Eternal Darkness revival that got harder and harder to believe, especially after the frankly embarrassing Kickstarter campaign for Shadow of the Eternals. I don't want to talk about what got that Kickstarter pulled, but rest assured, not good. Look it up if you're truly curious. It's a miracle that anything good came from the studio, but even so, you have to give them credit because they did make some really incredible stuff when they put their back into it. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think if you like this video. Click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter and book me on Cameo at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.